Viewer discretion is advised. This story contains themes of psychological horror, historical violence, and religious imagery. It is recommended for mature audiences only. All characters and events are fictional. The Saint of Justice, a tale of reckoning. The Bells of Seville tolled with a mournful pride as Father Mateo de la Cruz strode through the courtyard of the Inquisition citadel, the sound echoing off sun-bleached stone and whispering across the crimson banners that bore the cross of St. James. To the people, he was the very hand of divine justice, El Santo de la Justicia, a man who burned sin from flesh with the same fervor saints were said to burn away doubt. Mothers crossed themselves when he passed, men lowered their gaze, children whispered his name as though invoking a prayer or a curse. But behind the solemn robes and the cold certainty of his sermons, Mateo carried a secret no confession could absolve. His rise had not been a miracle of faith, but a bargain struck in shadow. Years ago, as a young cleric desperate for recognition, he had condemned a fellow novice, a friend, to heresy. The accusation was false, whispered into the Grand Inquisitor's ear out of envy and fear of obscurity. The boy's screams still haunted the stone corridors of Mateo's dreams. Now, each dawn, Mateo knelt before the altar, lips moving through prayers that never seemed to reach heaven. He told himself his hands were clean, that his cruelty served a holy cause. Yet, when candlelight caught his eyes, something restless flickered there. Doubt or perhaps guilt masquerading as piety. At court, he played his part to perfection. Before the Grand Inquisitor, he was the embodiment of discipline, always ready to press the iron, to draw confession from even the proudest heretic. He fed on the awe that surrounded him, on the illusion that his faith was unbreakable. But in the quiet of his chambers, where incense could not mask the scent of scorched flesh, Mateo would hear faint knocking from behind the walls, timid, rhythmic, familiar. He told himself it was the wind, though he knew better. The Saint of Justice was, in truth, a man haunted by his own inquisition. The air in Seville turned uneasy, long before anyone could name why. It began as murmurs carried by market women and echoed by altar boys, talk of a prisoner unlike any other, a man who would not bleed, whose wounds refused to stay open. The rumor drifted upward through the city's narrow streets until it reached the carved spires of the Cathedral of St. Mary, where it took on the weight of prophecy. Father Mateo de la Cruz first heard it in the cloister, where the candle smoke hung thick and heavy as guilt. Two young inquisitors whispered as they scrubbed the marble floors, their words trembling with both fear and awe. El Testigo, they say he cannot die. At the sound of the name, Mateo's brush froze midair. Something cold and ancient curled around his spine. That evening, as the cathedral bells tolled vespers, Mateo walked the nave alone. The stained glass saints looked down in judgment, their colors bleeding into the floor like spilled wine. Outside, the city buzzed with a feverish curiosity. Inside, silence reigned, except for the soft, hollow sound of his own steps and the echo of his thoughts. When he reached the confessional, he paused. A draft slipped through the lattice, carrying the faint scent of iron and candle wax. El Testigo, the witness, a name that felt like accusation. He told himself it was nonsense, a tale born of peasant superstition. Yet a memory stirred, of a face in the dark, of a boy praying to be spared, and of a voice that had whispered back, "I will remember." The next morning, the rumor became fact. A messenger from the tribunal arrived, his boots caked with the dust of travel and fear. He bowed low and spoke the words that would unmake Mateo's peace forever. "The Grand Inquisitor commands your presence. A new heretic has been captured. He asks for you by name." The dungeon beneath the tribunal was a world apart from God's light, a labyrinth of damp corridors and iron doors where screams were swallowed by stone. Father Mateo descended with a torch in hand, its flame bending in the stale air. Each step echoed like a confession he dared not make. When he reached the final cell, 2 guards stood aside without a word. Inside sat the prisoner, known only as El Testigo. He was unshackled, his hands resting calmly on his knees. The faint glow from the torch painted his face in gold and shadow, unremarkable at first glance, yet somehow unforgettable. His eyes, pale and depthless, carried the weariness of centuries. "You claim to bear witness," Matteo began, his voice measured, echoing off the damp walls. "To what, exactly?" The prisoner tilted his head. "To you, Father Matteo de la Cruz." The torchlight flickered, and something within Matteo faltered. He had faced witches, blasphemers, and liars who spat at the cross, but none who spoke his name with such quiet certainty. "I do not know you," Matteo replied, though the words came out more like a plea than a statement. A faint smile curved on the prisoner's lips. Sad, knowing. "Oh, but I know you. The boy who prayed in the orchard of St. Dominic, begging for mercy while the world burned around him." The torch nearly slipped from Matteo's hand. That memory, buried beneath decades of ritual and denial, flared in his mind like a wound reopening. A child kneeling in the dirt, whispering desperate prayers as his village burned, and a voice, soft, cold, promising salvation. "You mock me," he snapped, regaining his composure. "Confess your heresy, and perhaps your soul may yet—" "Be saved?" the prisoner interrupted, leaning forward. The chains at his ankles clinked softly. "You mistake me for one of your kind. I have come not for salvation, but remembrance." Matteo stepped back, suddenly aware of how small the cell felt, how close the air pressed against his skin. The torch sputtered, and for a heartbeat, the prisoner's eyes reflected no light at all, only the vast, dark patience of something eternal. And when the silence finally broke, it was Matteo's own heart that seemed to echo in the hollow chamber, whispering a truth he refused to name. The torture chamber was meant to be Matteo's dominion, a cathedral of pain where the confessions of sinners were carved from flesh. But that night, the instruments betrayed him. The irons grew too hot to hold, hissing and crackling like living serpents. The whips seemed to twitch of their own accord, and the wooden rack groaned as though it were breathing. Shadows danced along the walls in shapes that mirrored faces Matteo had condemned decades ago. Faces twisted in agony, eyes accusing, mouths open in silent screams. Matteo clenched his hands around the tools, trying to anchor himself in reason, but even his apprentices noticed the tremor that ran from his wrist to his jaw. He hid it, forcing a calm that was a mask over rising panic. The Grand Inquisitor's voice echoed in his memory, a cold admonition from council chambers. Faith is tested through pain, not fear. Yet the tools themselves seemed to mock him, whispering faintly like the rustle of wings or distant voices. "Remember what you did. Remember whom you condemned." In the corner, a candle guttered, throwing elongated shadows that morphed into impossible forms. His victims, the innocents whose names he had erased from memory, now returned to watch him. Matteo closed his eyes and heard them in the dark. The orphaned girl he had accused of witchcraft, the trembling merchant who had begged for mercy, the boy whose cries had once saved him from his own fears. He opened his eyes again to find El Testigo watching him, calm and unyielding, as though he had anticipated every tremor of doubt and every flicker of guilt. The prisoner said nothing, yet his gaze carried accusation heavier than any iron clamp. Matteo's chest tightened, his heart beat loud enough to drown out the faint whispers from the instruments themselves. The chamber, once a stage for his authority, had become a mirror. And for the first time, Matteo realized the truth. It was not he who wielded the tools, but they that were wielding him. The cathedral was quiet that afternoon, sunlight pooling in fractured colors across the cold stone floor. Matteo knelt in the confessional, the scent of incense clinging to his robes like a second skin. He came seeking solace, an absolution that might steady the trembling in his hands, the shadows that clung to his heart. But when the lattice slid open, it was not the voice of a fellow priest that answered. It was the prisoner's. El Testigo. Calm, measured, knowing every hesitation, every unspoken fear. "Forgive me," Matteo whispered at first, believing he was confessing to God alone. The words were fragile, cracking in the silence. "Forgive me for all the lives I've condemned, all the innocents—" "Speak them," the prisoner interrupted softly. "Every name, every sin." Matteo's throat tightened. The act of confession, usually a release, now became a trap. Every word he spoke seemed to anchor him more firmly to the darkness he had inflicted. He whispered names long buried, a merchant accused of heresy for teaching forbidden texts, a widow condemned for superstition, a boy, small and trembling, whose death had saved Mateo's own ambition. And with each name, the air in the confessional thickened. Shadows coiled around him, flickering like the faces of the condemned. Mateo realized, too late, that this was no ordinary confession. It was an unmasking. Every syllable he spoke strengthened El Testigo's presence, weaving the tapestry of his own guilt into the room, knot by knot. When he finished, he lifted his head, expecting judgment from God or man. But all he saw was the calm, unblinking gaze of the prisoner. Mateo understood then that confession was no longer a private rite. It was a mirror of the soul, and he was trapped within it, exposed, unprotected, utterly vulnerable. The cathedral, once a sanctuary, had become a chamber of reckoning. In the shadowed recesses of the tribunal's library, Mateo stumbled upon a ledger that should have remained hidden, a tome bound in worn leather, its pages etched with ink that had long since darkened like dried blood. He turned each page cautiously, the musty scent of parchment mingling with candle smoke, until a name leapt from the text, El Testigo. The entries told a story no one dared speak aloud. Even the Grand Inquisitor, the iron fist of the Inquisition, had once faced this prisoner, and had spared him not out of mercy but out of terror. The records detailed confessions coerced under torture, broken bodies that healed overnight, instruments of pain rendered useless, and voices whispering truths too terrible to name. The man, or whatever he was, had returned again and again, a constant shadow over those who wielded holy authority with cruelty or ambition. Mateo's fingers shook as he traced the ink, his mind reeling. The ledger contained not just historical accounts, but a warning. Those who judged in God's name would one day be judged themselves. And Mateo, who had spent his life perfecting the art of fear, now realized that the fear he inspired might one day return to claim him. The cathedral bells tolled outside, each note striking like a heartbeat, echoing his sudden awareness of his own fragility. The saint of justice, revered and feared, felt the first tremor of doubt. Loyalty, once as steady as the stones of Seville, began to waver. The world he had built on piety and terror was not immutable. And for the first time, Mateo wondered if the very hand of God, or something older, darker, was moving against him. The dungeon smelled of damp stone and despair as Mateo descended, torch in hand, summoned to carry out the sentence he had rehearsed in every shadowed thought for weeks. El Testigo was to die. It was a simple command, one that should have required no hesitation. And yet, with each step down the narrow spiral stair, a gnawing unease hollowed Mateo from within. When he reached the final cell, his expectations shattered. The prisoner sat unchained, serene, as if waiting for him specifically. The torchlight trembled, casting long shadows on the walls, and Mateo realized the air itself seemed heavier, charged with a presence that defied reason. "Your time has come," Mateo said, trying to summon the authority that had never failed him before. But his voice faltered, small and brittle in the cold expanse. El Testigo's eyes, calm and endless, met his. "You will see them all," he said softly. "Every soul you condemned, every life you took, every scream you ignored." And then the visions began. The walls dissolved into a panorama of memory and judgment. He saw merchants, children, widows, and priests he had condemned, all twisting in agony, their eyes pleading, accusing. And there, amid the chaos of the damned, he saw the face he had thought long buried, his mother, accused of witchcraft decades ago, trembling as she was dragged to a pyre. "Mother!" Mateo screamed, staggering back, the torch clattering to the floor. The flames flickered violently, then extinguished themselves, leaving only shadows and the icy touch of silence. El Testigo remained, unshaken, a silent conductor of Mateo's reckoning. The Inquisitor, who had spent his life meting out pain, now understood the full weight of his sins. The dungeon had become a theater, and he, its unwilling actor, trapped in the horrors he had created. For the first time, The saint of justice felt the raw, unrelenting terror of helplessness, and he understood this was not punishment, it was revelation. The morning light of Seville failed to pierce the shadows that now hung heavy over the tribunal. Mateo stumbled from the dungeon, his robes damp with sweat and ash, the taste of iron thick on his tongue. But the horrors of the previous night had not been contained to him alone. The tribunal awoke to an unthinkable revelation. Their inquisitorial seals, symbols of authority and divine sanction, had burned themselves into their flesh, deep and raw. Pain rippled across the chamber as one by one, each inquisitor was forced to endure visions of the torments they had inflicted. A priest wept as the rack bent his spine in agony. A judge screamed as invisible flames licked his skin. A secretary clawed at the walls as the echoing cries of those he condemned filled his ears. Mateo tried to intervene, to steady the chaos, to remind them all that reason and law were supposed to govern their actions. But his voice, usually commanding, faltered in the face of the surreal judgment. The instruments of torture seemed alive now, no longer tools but instruments of divine reckoning, turning their master's own cruelty back upon them. And through it all, the Grand Inquisitor's face remained stern, unreadable, almost welcoming. "Behold," he declared, his voice echoing through the chamber like the tolling of a distant bell, "God's true Inquisition." Mateo's heart hammered against his ribs. The weight of his deeds pressed upon him with a force he had never known. Every scream he had once dismissed as necessary, every plea he had ignored, now came back to him multiplied, filling the tribunal with a chorus of accusation and despair. The world he had known, the certainty, the authority, the fear he commanded, was gone. And in its place rose a reckoning far older, far deeper than any earthly tribunal could administer. The chamber was silent now, save for the faint drip of water from a cracked stone ceiling. Mateo sank to his knees, exhausted, broken, every nerve raw from the visions and torments that had shaken the tribunal to its core. He looked up at El Testigo, who stood calmly, as if the chaos around them had never existed. "Please," Mateo whispered, his voice trembling, "forgive me, whatever I've done, whatever I've failed to prevent." The prisoner's lips curved in a faint, sorrowful smile. From the folds of his robe he produced a small, polished mirror and extended it toward Mateo. The Inquisitor's hands shook as he took it, feeling the cold weight of its frame as though it were heavier than any iron chain. When Mateo looked into the glass, the reflection shocked him. It was not his own face alone, but his own body, bound, broken, dressed in the simple rags of a prisoner. Every mark, every scar, every crease of suffering mirrored his own past cruelties. The image was alive, flickering subtly as if breathing, the chains tightening with every pulse of the room. "El Testigo," Mateo breathed, terror and awe mingling in his voice. What is this?" The prisoner's gaze held him fast. "Every tormentor becomes the tormented," he said softly. "Every hand that raised pain, every soul that judged in arrogance, they will know the weight they once dispensed. Such is divine symmetry." Mateo's knees buckled beneath him. The mirror did not lie. The Inquisitor who had commanded fear now saw himself as the condemned, the predator rendered prey. And in that instant, every sin, every act of cruelty, every whisper of justification burned with a clarity he had never known. He understood with a dawning horror that mercy and judgment were not gifts he could control. They were truths that could not be escaped. The world around Mateo dissolved into darkness. When he opened his eyes, he was not in the chamber of visions or the cathedral's nave, but in a cell he knew too well, the cold stone, the iron shackles, the oppressive silence that seemed to press against his chest. He struggled, testing the bonds that held him, but they were unyielding, biting into his wrists and ankles with the memory of his own cruelty. Through the heavy door, footsteps approached, slow, deliberate, echoing off the walls. Mateo's heart hammered, dread pooling in his stomach. And then they appeared, his inquisitors stepping into the torchlight, each face eerily familiar. As they drew closer, the horrifying truth struck him. Their faces were his own. Every grim line, every scar, every shadow of guilt mirrored back at him in a multitude of living reflections. The wheel had turned. The Inquisition had never truly ended. Its judgment was eternal, its hunger insatiable, and now it had chosen him. The saint of justice, once feared across Seville, was now prey to the very terror he had wielded. Mateo fell to his knees, staring at the sea of his own faces surrounding him, each silent, each accusing, each ready to enact the inexorable law of retribution. There was no escape, no mercy, no intercession. The flames of his ambition, his pride, his sins, all had led him here, to this infinite tribunal of self. The chains rattled, the walls whispered, and in the oppressive stillness, Mateo understood the cruelest truth of all. The Inquisition did not judge only others. It was a cycle that devoured its believers in turn, and now it had devoured him. He was both inquisitor and heretic, executioner and condemned, lost forever in the eternal shadow of his own making.